What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. A bit ahead of the PC release of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which I am very interested in taking a look at, but obviously I wanted to start with the first one. Now, before we dive into that fully, somewhat bizarrely actually, I have to explain that Square Enix actually sent me a copy of this, despite the game both having been out on PC for a while and having released several years prior. When Rebirth first launched earlier in 2024, they had reached out and asked if I wanted to review it, and I explained that, it's a PC channel, so it being a PlayStation exclusive, it wasn't really going to work. But right after it was announced that Rebirth was coming to PC on the 23rd at the Game Awards, Square Enix reached out again and was like, hey, we know you're a PC channel, would you like a copy of the first game to check out before the second one drops? And obviously I accepted that, and here we are. As it lined up with my own plans to check this game out anyway ahead of Rebirth coming to PC, because I'd wanted to take a look at both of them for a little while. And the reason I wanted to look at them is that, as I've mentioned a couple times recently, Final Fantasy VII, the original game, was like the first big RPG I ever beat on my own when I was like 7 years old. It's a sort of core gaming memory for me. And as a result, for a long time, I had kind of put off engaging with the remakes, because what Final Fantasy VII was to me was kind of already cemented in my own memories, and I didn't really want to mess with that too much, truth be told. But as time has gone by, and I've kind of learned that these remakes are fully their own thing, I got a lot more comfortable with the idea of taking a look at them and enjoying them for what they are. And we'll talk a little bit more about memories versus what this game is momentarily, but the first impressions-wise, I've really got to mention is naturally how this game was running, etc., which might be of interest to other people, given that they are potentially also looking at this ahead of Rebirth coming to PC. But on that note, two things I wanted to mention. For starters, this game's default keyboard layout is very odd. It's not unplayable, but I did have to mess with it a lot to get it to a comfortable place, and this is because there are some keys that cannot be rebound at all, and other keys that, while you can rebind them, you definitely don't want to. So for instance, the default way to navigate through menus is the arrow keys, and I tried to add a secondary keybind to WASD, which you might normally use to navigate a menu otherwise, which is a bit more comfortable for me at least, but unfortunately, if you do that, you won't be able to manually move your characters through the action-focused combat. So as pretty much always with Square Enix, the keyboard and mouse controls on their PC ports tend to be a little hit or miss, but I was ultimately able to get it set up to a point where I was comfortable with it, even if I wouldn't consider it perfect. Though the other thing I wanted to mention is that while this game does look very good, I actually had a very specific issue that I wanted to mention, and that is that when I first fired it up, I was getting a ton of screen flickering, especially around any source of light. And after messing around with the game's graphical settings, I actually had to turn up the game's FPS cap in order to fix this. It was set to a default of 60, and in order to get that screen flickering to go away, I had to match the FPS cap for the game with my monitor's refresh rate, which was 120, and that got the screen flickering to disappear finally. Now, beyond just technical stuff, let's talk about the rest of this. Now, Final Fantasy VII in general has you playing as Cloud Strife, who gets involved with a resistance group known as Avalanche, fighting off the company Shinra, who is bleeding the planet dry, quite literally siphoning off its energy in order to maintain all of its big city, Midgar. Now, this remake, of which there is going to be a full trilogy at some point, is only the first part of Final Fantasy VII's story, which is the time you spend in the city of Midgar before you leave, and it opens up the rest of the way. So there's some things I want to mention there right away. I know for a fact the story deviates quite a bit from the original games just in totality. I don't know exactly what Rebirth covers, I'll get there when I get there, but I know there's supposed to be like alternate timelines and stuff. Ultimately though, this means a couple of things. For starters, they've obviously changed some stuff to fit that part of Final Fantasy VII's story into a much longer action game, via introducing some characters I know weren't in the original story sequences that weren't here, but probably most interesting of all to me are these like ghost-like things that show up. I believe they call them whispers, which can be seen around both Cloud and Aerith. They even make a big attack at one point early on in the game, and clearly they're going to be doing something that's quite a bit different than the original. But in a lot of other ways, the story here seems to be setting things up in a way where you learn about or engage with some things earlier than you would have normally in the original, that is. For instance, Sephiroth isn't really present in the Midgar section of the original, but we keep seeing flashbacks of him here. And then another change, I guess, was to point Shinra more directly as the bad guy, as the early game scene where you start the game by blowing up a reactor in order to, of course, disrupt Shinra's plans. Actually doesn't go quite the way it does in the original, where Shinra goes out of their way to make that explosion much, much worse than it was, presumably to paint Avalanche as much worse than it actually is. So I think a lot of those different plot threads will be interesting to see how they wind up panning out and being both different and similar at the same time. But that's honestly exactly what I was after, because it's a really big nostalgia hit. In fact, there's a flashback where it shows Tifa and Cloud in their village that they grew up in, and the sort of water tower they're on was just like a huge hit of nostalgia for me. But so far, pretty cool. That's hardly the only thing going on here though, because obviously the other big switch is that this combat is much more action-oriented than its counterpart, though that seems to be a pretty clear direction that the Final Fantasy series has been headed into for a while, so it's not really that surprising, though maybe a little more so when this game actually released. But I will say I like how they blended elements of the original into this action system pretty well, so rather than the active time battle gauge or whatever it was called, I believe, dictating everything you do, here you can make sort of basic attacks on your own outside of that, but in order to do things like use items or activate abilities, you have to let that gauge fill up. It has 2 charges, and you can just wait until it fills up, or you can attack things to help it fill up faster, and then when you get a bar full, you can then activate your abilities and whatnot. But that's in addition to things like your normal combos. And then if you want to summon something, you'll get summon materia right away, and that has to be slotted into its own separate summoning slot for your gear. Because the materia system seems to be pretty much exactly what I remember it. In order to use skills, magic abilities, all that, you typically have to find it as a materia, a sort of magic crystal, if you will, that you can slot into your gear, and it will then provide those effects to that character. So sometimes you'll find gear with more or less materia slots, some of which is linked together, which can cause you to link different effects of materia together to produce different effects, and that system, again, seems to be exactly what I remember it being. Otherwise, in combat, you'll also fill up your limit breaker as you participate in combat, your big ultimate attacks that you can occasionally use on top of things like summons, and that's going to basically be the bulk of it. Now, what I'm especially interested in is the hard mode. So after you beat the game the first time on any difficulty, you unlock hard mode, which then restricts you from using things like items, or regaining any of your MP or your ability to use a lot of those moves on your own. So you have to find ways to circumvent that, and I'm actually really curious about what the difficulty curve of that specifically is like, because here in the early game, it's fairly straightforward as far as action game stuff goes, though that is honestly to be expected. Now, what I did find especially curious, though, is there are actually other difficulty options besides what you see here, such as the classic version of normal and easy, which will give you the ability to sort of auto attack and defend, so you can focus more on simply utilizing your character's abilities, which I thought was an interesting way to approach that. Although speaking of difficulty, I assume this is tied to the version that launched on PC somehow because it includes its DLC, but there is an option at the beginning to start the game at a better place, like higher level with more money and stuff, which obviously isn't for me as I am reviewing this one, but I will say that does seem like a convenient feature for the people specifically looking to simply play through this before the sequel drops. But ultimately, I'll have to see how combat and stuff evolves over the course of this playthrough, because with this being a mostly linear adventure through a bunch of chapters because of the nature of, being confined to Midgar and those plot elements of the story, it'll be interesting to see how much they try to vary that up and change it. But I'm looking forward to running through it and figuring it out. But to start wrapping this up, basically, so far so good. I like that they've honestly included a blend of what I know was here, but also mixed a lot of that stuff up, even down to things like the story presentation, and giving themselves the opportunity to flesh some of these characters out, like especially Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge. And I also like how the combat system retains elements of the original while also being clearly a different thing. It's a neat way to bring that forward, I suppose. So for the most part, things are looking good here, but obviously I want to see how that plays out over the course of 2 separate playthroughs, because as I move to review this game, a few things to note. It's going to take me a little while, for a couple different reasons, not least of which is because I will be busy with some other stuff I can't talk about yet, but also because to 100% this game, it is a mandatory full 2 playthroughs. You have to play through it once to unlock hard mode, and then you have to run through hard mode, and then you also have to use chapter select to go back through and play replay certain parts of it over and over again, or at least a couple more times, I should say, in order to grab some of the achievements, and most estimates put this at around 80 to 100 hours, which seems to probably check out. Simply put, I have no idea when you'll actually see the review for this one, hopefully not much longer than a couple of weeks, but it's very hard to say at the moment. First impressions wise, it's off to a very good start outside of just the keyboard controls and having to set all that up. That's probably been the only part I haven't enjoyed thus far, and I'm looking forward to seeing if they can maintain this momentum over the course of the rest of the game, and I'm very much so looking forward to investigating exactly what's different versus the original, which I think will be part of the fun for me. But as of right now, that's gonna do it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.